That afternoon began like any other in the slow-breathing countryside, where days seldom strayed from their familiar rhythm. Sunlight drifted lazily across the rows of corn, pouring a honey-gold sheen over the Newell family's rooftop. The last winds of the season tilted through the fields, carrying with them the scent of damp soil and sun-scorched grass, as if the sky itself were drawing in a deep, steadying breath, hoping to hold on to the final calm before the inevitable broke through. In the small garden behind the house, Deep was bent over a row of mustard greens planted tight against the wooden fence. Her hands were still smudged with earth, her nails darkened by sun and soil, yet her movements were gentle, reverent, like she was quietly asking each leaf for permission before touching it. For her, tending the garden was never just labor, it was a pulse, a sanctuary, a place where she tucked away the things she never dared to speak aloud. Every root, every sprout was something she wished she could keep for herself. She didn't hear the first footstep, its sound lost somewhere in the murmuring wind. But then the steps grew clearer, slow, deliberate, too familiar to confuse with anyone else's. Her heart stalled, as though someone had pressed a cold fingertip against it. She turned. And he was standing there, James, still the same tall, lean figure. Still that distant look in his eyes, the kind carried only by those who have seen too much and spoken too little. But something had shifted in him. She couldn't tell whether it was in his gaze or his breath, a weariness he could no longer hide, a fear pushed all the way to the edge. Deep said nothing. The afternoon sun cast a golden dust over him, making him look like someone who had wandered out of an old memory she had fought to bury beneath silence. "You're still here," he said, his voice raw, as if scraped across hundreds of miles of rough road. "And you," Deep answered softly, "chose to walk away." There was no accusation in her tone, only the quiet ache of a wound long accustomed to lying still. James lowered his eyes. His shoulders tightened, as if he were bracing for something far heavier than blame, her forgiveness. But James had not come back for nostalgia. He had come back for his father, and whatever waited behind that wooden door might bring everything to an end. The Newell home had always carried the scent of pine wood and John's old tobacco, the remnants of a man who lived by rules too rigid to make room for tenderness. He had once been a soldier, once a pillar of strength, once a tall, looming shadow cast over all of James's childhood. But now John was a man who had just endured a stroke, lying motionless like a warrior finally overtaken by time. James halted at the doorway. Something in him refused to place his hand on the knob. He had fled this house years ago, fled his father's eyes, his father's voice, fled the version of himself that lived under this roof. He left believing that somewhere else, he might finally be able to breathe, but hope wasn't what brought him back. Fear did. Fear that John might slip away before James could say what needed to be said. Or worse, before either of them understood the other. The door opened when Deep stepped in ahead of him. The living room was dim compared to the bright outdoors. The old clock on the wall continued its steady ticking, each sound echoing like the heartbeat of the house. John lay there, his complexion pale, his skin drained of strength. His eyes were half open, no longer the stern, commanding gaze James remembered, though something in them still made people stand straighter. He looked at James. James looked at him. 1 year. 2 years. 3. None of it was spoken. Silence pressed down on the room like a weight on the chest. Then John's voice broke the stillness, dry, brittle, like a piece of old timber snapping. This is the choice you made. Not, "You're home." Not, "Why didn't you call?" Not, "I missed you." James's jaw tightened. His lips pressed together until they whitened. Deep stood behind him, quiet as a tree's shadow, not stepping in, not stepping away. "I came because of you," James said. "Because of me?" John let out a hoarse, hollow laugh. "Or because you're afraid? You've been afraid since the beginning." The room chilled, as if a draft had slipped through a crack in the walls. On the wooden chair on the front porch sat a stranger, a wandering artist who had stayed around to help Deep during the months James was gone. He never pried, never asked for more than she wanted to offer. He simply existed beside her, steady and unintrusive, listening by not asking. His name was Eli. Eli watched the scene through the window. James standing in front of his father like a ghost returned to reclaim a place he never knew how to keep. Eli sketched a few lines, capturing the tension with the calm that seemed to come so naturally to him. He didn't know the whole story, but he knew this. The deepest wounds in a family were rarely made by what was said, they were carved by what never made it into words. "You pushed me out of this house," James said, voice low but gathering edge, "because you were weak." "I was a child, not your soldier." John tried to lift himself, breath shuddering, but his gaze still sharp. "A man doesn't get to be weak even for 1 day." James shook his head slowly. "No, father." "A man becomes a man only when he can name the places where he's weak." Deep's hands tightened in front of her. She knew this moment could decide everything. James might stay, or he might walk away again, this time for good. Suddenly John's hand jerked upward, as if to reach for the blanket or slam the table, no one could tell. But his strength failed him. He sagged, breath-breaking. James lunged forward. "Dad." And in that instant, something in John's armor cracked, something he had carried for decades. His deepest fear surfaced, clearer than the illness itself, fear that he didn't have enough time left to fix what he had broken. "Put your hand here," John rasped, pointing to his shoulder. James obeyed, for the first time. John whispered, breath thin, "I see you strong enough to come home." James bowed his head, his shoulders trembling though he tried to stay steady. All their lives, father and son had spoken only through damage. This was the first time they spoke through truth, and truth hurt. Deep watched them, and something inside her fractured. She had once loved James with a heart that knew no guard. She had once waited for him with a hope so small she feared admitting it even to herself. But now, seeing him tremble before the man he both feared and loved so fiercely, she understood that his wounds ran deeper than anything she had imagined. And perhaps, just perhaps, he had come back not only because his father was ill, but because of her. Out on the porch, Eli lowered his pencil. He didn't draw. For a moment, the calmness he wore so easily slipped away. He sat still as though watching a door close that he wasn't ready to see shut. He understood, now, that James was not merely someone passing through Deep's life. And perhaps, Eli was. Tomorrow, Eli murmured to himself, "I'll move on." The evening breeze lifted a few pages of his sketches into the air. Inside the house, James kept his hand on his father's shoulder. Deep stood behind him, her eyes glowing like a candle in the wind, full of hope, full of fear. Outside, Eli's shadow stretched long across the ground, a silent farewell unspoken. And the sun, the sole witness to every unfolding truth, slipped behind the trees, leaving behind a streak of red like the last mark of a page ready to turn. The day had begun like any ordinary afternoon, but it ended like a crack through which the light could finally enter.